Hey everyone, I've been a little longer than usual between videos because I've been dealing with a kidney stone that left me huddled in a sweaty, whimpering pile on the emergency room floor. It is still in there, but the pain has resided enough to allow me to talk to everyone about why I've stopped playing Destiny 2 again this year. As an update for future plans, I got something I want to do on Neo 2, I'll deal with Doom Eternal, and I'm going to be doing a response to an excellent email I got regarding my Spec Ops The Line video that'll talk about our expectations when we play games and how that affects what we think of them. Which will also kind of talk about Ori and the Will of the Wisps. But today, let's figure out why Destiny has lost me for only the third time in 5 years, and how I'm actually less interested now than I was even in the dog days of Destiny 1 Year 3, or the disaster that was Destiny 2 from launch through Warmind. I have a lot of complaints, but I'm also going to give what I think are relatively easy solutions for most of them. None of my solutions aside from one require Bungie to spend vastly more money or resources on the game. I'll give tangible changes to systems that are already there. If you find my arguments interesting, I'd ask you to share this on the Destiny Reddit so we can maybe get a few more views and start a discussion about the game's very serious issues. Also, subscribe. Alright, after the logo. A roadmap of my complaints. I've been thinking an awful lot about what's got me so uninterested in Destiny 2 lately, and I've focused it down to just a few crucial issues that have, to one degree or another, been present in Destiny for years. We'll start with what's probably the most important one: progression. In my opinion, there are 3 parts of progression that are super important for any game like this: power climb, gear acquisition, and RPG build progression. Amazingly, Bungie is now failing in every one of those things, but before we get into specifics, I want to take a moment to discuss the fact that Bungie still doesn't fully understand the game they make, which leaves it with constantly disappointing RPG elements. Then we'll touch on the utter failure of Destiny 2's storytelling and the Season Pass model, and how that combines with Eververse to make Destiny feel less like an MMO and more like a free-to-play game. And just to be clear, Destiny is not free-to-play. Warframe is free-to-play. Fortnite is free-to-play. Apex Legends and Warzone and Path of Exile are free-to-play. In those games, every player gets to play all the content that is released with the game's revenue coming solely from a microtransaction shop. You might have paid progression like in Warframe, or simply cosmetic items like Apex, but as a player, there's no content that you cannot play for free. Destiny 2 isn't that. So let's hop right into what I hope to be a fairly short video by talking about how Bungie still, after all of these years, simply doesn't fully understand how games like Diablo, or Warcraft, or Warframe keep players continually engaged over time. I've talked before about how I am extremely sympathetic to the difficulty inherent in balancing the vision for a game like Destiny. A game that, it's easy to forget, was and remains an innovative title. Many have compared Destiny to Borderlands, but that's not a terribly useful comparison. It's pretty obvious, looking back at D1's early development, that the original vision was, without a doubt, more ambitious than Borderlands. Borderlands has some multiplayer components, but it simply isn't a multiplayer game. It's a single-player game with co-op available and a couple of missions that require teams. From its inception, Destiny was heavily focused on multiplayer. Borderlands is a single-player game with some co-op. Destiny is a multiplayer game that has some solo stuff. From social spaces to daily quests, multiple currencies, and on and on and on, Destiny is inspired by MMOs as much as it is inspired by FPS games. The moment you realize that, you see some of the inherent tensions in the design. MMOs keep players invested by real, powerful, tangible progression systems. Levels, gear scores, and a steady and compelling climb up a ladder of content difficulty. All of this is made possible by gating stuff off behind systems and numbers and not player skill. FPS games aren't really balanced around back-end numbers. They're balanced by skill and mastery. This is why The Division felt so strange to many players. It simply feels weird to mix the twitch aspects of a shooter with heavy back-end numbers. It's why dumping 11 clips from an LMG into a guy with a bat wearing a hoodie is so odd feeling. But nobody thinks it's weird when a Murloc instantly kills you with one swipe because you're underleveled. Let's focus on Warcraft for just a moment, because that's where most of my MMO experience comes from. I played WoW from launch until the first raid tier of Warlords of Draenor. What kept me, like most players, playing WoW was the fact that the progression had a constant, interesting, and multifaceted climb to it. You leveled up questing through the story of an expansion. While leveling, you not only increased back-end numbers, you slowly unlocked new gameplay tools and skills and spells. On top of that grind, you had gear that fundamentally altered your character. Those leveling systems not only increased your power, they set you on a content path, from questing, to dungeons, to heroics, to dailies, to raids. Each content set along the way gave you the progression to get to the next level. So, the power climb isn't the point of the progression. The power climb is there to allow you to access the next level of content, and that power climb wasn't short. Becoming powerful enough to raid was a time investment. And then there are all the other ancillary things to occupy your time during and after the progression climb, things like professions, trading, and the economy and the story. When it's all said and done, each WoW expansion had set you on another climb, invalidating all your gear and starting the process over. And it's super important to point out one last thing. When Warcraft expansions release, the associated raids don't release 5 days later. The raids start rolling out weeks or months after launch, and the final tiers that end the expansion happen nearly a year later. And crucially, the very best gear was only available in the raids. If you wanted to raid, you needed to get better gear, and to get the best gear, you needed to raid weekly. You could still just play the game regularly but casually and not be a part of the endgame progression. But if you wanted to play the endgame, there were tangible, rare, powerful, and compelling rewards for your effort and time. Once transmog was brought to the game, progression was pretty great, allowing you to keep turning over your gear, but also letting you make any piece look like your old beloved raid gear that you worked so hard to get. Which also added reasons to go back and play older raids, often soloing them to get cool looking sets. At the end of the day, that's an extremely satisfying form of long-term progression across multiple systems that has actual endgame content as its own reward. The game sets a series of short and medium-term goals in front of you on your way to the final long-term goal of completing the raid and acquiring the best possible gear that is only available in the endgame. To finish the raids, you needed to level through each of the previous tiers, and because gear progression is slow, each important drop feels impactful and exciting. That is the tried and true model for most MMOs. Now, on the other end of the looter spectrum, you've got something like Borderlands, where the constant acquisition of gear is the endgame. It is a never-ending cycle of higher numbers and better affixes on guns that you then use in the same activity to get higher numbers and better affixes on guns. This works as well as it does in Borderlands because the actual guns are so odd, and mostly they're fully randomized, so there's a nearly infinite variety available. Destiny has always tried to straddle this line between MMO and loot grinder, and in Destiny 1, they did it far better than Destiny 2. Why do I say that? Well, to begin with, Destiny 1 stuck to its guns by invalidating your gear regularly, which is a bedrock, absolutely crucial system that must exist. If you don't need new gear to access new content, the entire point of progression comes crashing down. In fact, the very best Destiny did this was the House of Wolves era, where they still invalidated your gear, but let you do specific endgame activities to bring one piece of gear a week forward with you in progression, which was the best of both worlds. You could bring stuff forward, but you had to do an endgame activity, and you would end up using new things while you decided which stuff you wanted enough to spend a precious resource on. Your Fatebringer, Matador, and BTRD, most likely. As it currently stands, power progression in Destiny 2 is completely pointless. Nearly every endgame activity is available a week after launch. An actual power climb can be accomplished entirely through public events. You can just run bounties on planets and go straight to the one raid that doesn't offer any progression at all outside of a back-end number. And that back-end number, your power level, unlike an MMO, is totally pointless. Scaling means you'll never outlevel an area, and almost nothing in the game benefits from getting even close to the hard cap outside a couple of activities. And those rare exceptions ultimately fail, because they don't have any reward that's worth the effort. This refusal to institute a real progression system means that once you've played the content in Destiny, there's no reason to do so again, other than for the gameplay itself. And to be fair, the gameplay is good enough that when there's not much else going on in gaming, it is still a fun game to play. But this past year has been absurd with the amount of excellent titles released, so competition for my attention is higher than ever. Destiny simply does not have a compelling reason to acquire power levels. Everything is too fast, too easy, and there's not enough content gated behind the grind to be worth it. If the only aspirational content is the one raid, you only need to get to the level that allows you to comfortably complete the raid before you are done. If Destiny 2 more carefully plotted its leveling, this problem would be much less severe, though it wouldn't go away. Each expansion should require you to run the campaign. After that, you're leveled enough to do adventures on planets. That should level you enough to go through all the lost sectors. After the lost sectors, you should now be leveled enough to do strikes. Strikes should lead to nightfalls, and then nightfalls to raids, etc. Ideally, Bungie would release their raids for the year in tiers, so that players felt like they were playing one long raid broken into sections like in WoW, but that's a whole nother can of worms. The point is, by making it possible to level anywhere, there's no clear and compelling path forward. Instead, you kind of just putter around and do what you want. It takes away any semblance of a long-term goal. If you needed to do lost sectors to play strikes, then strikes are now a reward for gameplay. The reward for finishing each tier of content isn't pride and accomplishment, it's more, better content. Destiny 1 didn't fully commit to this structure, but it was still laid out much more closely to this model. There was an actual path through progression that allowed you to graduate to doing different content. It was not just all available at once. And of course, the first game had an important power incentive, because the raids had gear that was undeniably better than anything else you could get. Fatebringer was worth raiding for. Crota had weapons worth raiding for. King's Fall had one of the best looking armor sets they would ever make. And the raids were very, very stingy with their loot. It took me 10 weeks of raiding to get Fatebringer, and over a year to get the Mythoclast. It took me weeks and weeks to complete my Warlock set from King's Fall. I didn't get an Icebreaker for months. Which brings us to part 2 of Destiny 2's progression failure. Gear drop rates. Why does Borderlands succeed dropping mountains of loot on you, while Destiny fails doing the same? It's very simple. Borderlands has a much wider variety of weapons, and the game allows those weapons to roll an absurd variety of traits. And crucially, the very stats themselves are randomized across guns. 2 of the very same guns will have different stability, range, fire rates, and damage. Even something as crucial as magazine size can be vastly different between copies. Vastly different, not one shot different. It's the Diablo and Warcraft model. Because there is so much RNG in each loot drop, getting 30 copies of a weapon will be 30 different versions of the weapon. Destiny sets its stats as static on each gun. Every single Better Devils will have precisely the same range, recoil, damage, and fire rate as another. All of the RNG in each weapon is only tied to its perks. In Borderlands, you can get a gun you wanted, but it can have too much recoil, making it worthless. That simply cannot happen in Destiny 2. And because the perks available on each weapon come from a surprisingly small pool, it takes almost no time to find a great roll. And even more importantly, because the stats are static, almost every Better Devils or Ostringer or Blast Furnace is more than good enough for literally every situation you will encounter. The difference between a god-rolled Better Devils and a bad roll isn't very big. It's a marginal upgrade that you don't even feel outside of PvP or when you're underleveled the first time you run a raid. Not having Outlaw will never cause you to struggle, whereas having bad recoil or a smaller magazine or consuming 4 ammo per trigger pull on a gun in Borderlands, it will. This leaves Bungie only 2 choices to fix what has recently become a deeply unsatisfying loot system in its current form. Either greatly extend the grind by making weapon stats random so you can actually get a totally worthless better devils, or extend the grind by catastrophically lowering drop rates. Like, drastically lowering them. Either of these solutions would work, though I would vastly prefer insanely lower drop rates. Legendary weapons should drop 3 or 4 times a week in normal play, which would drive players to endgame, where legendary weapons would be made better than all others and be guaranteed drops. Strikes should have better guns and better drop rates than patrols. Nightfall better than strikes, and raid legendaries should be the equivalent of Recluse or Breakneck. There should be a small chance of getting great things dropping anywhere, but it should be ridiculously rare to get an Outlaw Rampage Better Devils from a public event or turning in tokens. Raids should be the only place to earn the very, very best static rolled weapons in PvE, and Iron Banner and Trials should be the only place to earn top guns through PvP. Exotic guns should drop maybe twice a month, and armor once a week, which makes Xur have an actual purpose again. And tokens and vendors need to have their cost per gun increased 5-fold at least. I have got thousands upon thousands of Gunsmith and Zavala tokens. I literally stopped turning them in because it was a chore to dismantle 10 guns every time I visited the tower. Vendors existed in Destiny 1 because legendary weapons were far more rare. RNG could be unkind, but the vendors were basically bad RNG protection. Even if you had bad luck, you could at least grind out currency and buy something decent. And occasionally, a gem would get spat out, like the Dead Orbit Hung Jury that was one of the best guns the game has ever seen. You can have loot drop like candy if you make guns so random that a ton of it is useless. Or, you can make all loot good and have it be rare. A game like this cannot keep my attention for very long if awesome good loot drops constantly to the point that your mailbox is full, and you actively avoid running over engrams because the odds of it being better than what you currently have equipped is very nearly zero. When everything that drops is good enough, and it drops all the time with almost zero effort required from the player, what is the point? Why raid more than once? Hell, the current state of raid gear has never been worse. Why raid at all? Nothing in the raid will be better than the 4 weapons that dropped doing patrols for 40 minutes. When you combine this loot system with gear staying relevant for literally years, the only way to push players to acquire loot is to release better and better guns, which eliminates any variety at all. If Recluse is the best around, and stays the best around until Recluse 2, there's no reason to find other gear. Destiny 2 needs to slash drop rates across the board, have guns only be viable for a year at a time, and make the very, very best gear only available on high-end activities, including the match-made endgame. It doesn't have to be only raids. Match-made high-difficulty Nightfalls is a good spot for this as well. And bringing back a system that lets you bring 3 guns a year forward would make it so there were hard choices about which guns you really wanted to take into the next expansion. That eliminates the legitimate problem of grinding the raid for 10 weeks only to have Recluse 2 drop 3 days before it's useless. Now, these broken progression systems don't mean the game is bad. What it means instead is that Destiny 2 can only be really good when it is rolling out brand new content. When that content is fucking great, like Taken King or Forsaken, it can keep you going for over a year. When it's barely mediocre, like Shadowkeep, it keeps you going for a month. And when it's just putrid, like the Season Pass shit, it keeps you going for a few hours. Which brings us to part 2. Content is king. Destiny has failed to find a consistently effective model for delivering its content over 5 years. Warcraft can deliver large amounts of shit to do because the game is now absurdly big, and it's charging a monthly fee. Destiny cannot do that. It's instead now settled into a weird hybrid model that I find extremely annoying. Destiny now makes money by hoovering up gameplay rewards and locking it in a cash shop, while also asking players to buy expansions and also asking players to buy a battle pass. There are so many problems with this current model, I barely know where to start. The total quality of the actual paid expansions has varied so much it's kind of amazing. Dark Below and Curse of Osiris are embarrassing. House of Wolves and Warmind were overpriced for the amount of content, but ultimately were enough to keep you engaged. The big $40 expansions, which I hope we will get this fall, have been unambiguously excellent. Excellent. And the smaller fall expansions can best be described as, meh, I guess that's enough for what I paid. Still, even with this varying quality, one at least knew that when you ponied up the money for expansions, you were getting everything that Bungie had developed, and if you waited and bought it a year later, you could still play it all, after taking the break that one needs to in order to stay sane as a Destiny player. This current model is now confusing, counterproductive, and ultimately bad for Bungie and the player. The Eververse store is a catastrophe from a gameplay perspective. A catastrophe. It takes one of the most important parts of any RPG, from Warcraft to Dark Souls, and removes it from being a gameplay reward and instead turns it into a mobile game reward for buying Bungie bucks. This needs to change. Period. And it needs to change in a way that both upholds the core appeal of the genre while also acknowledging the changing landscape of game economics. Which means an actual innovation is needed. Well, Bungie, I've got your solution. I've had it for ages, and I have said it in previous videos that no one's seen. And to counteract anyone complaining about charging for cosmetics at all, it is too late. This is the deal. You will need to pay for cosmetics in Destiny 2. That is an unchangeable fact. The only question is, how will that fact be implemented? There is a way to deal with these two opposing forces. First, let's agree this. Bungie's ornament system is a steaming pile of shit. It is just like transmog, except, worse in literally every possible way. It doesn't allow you to make armor look however you want. It allows you to make armor look like one of a few different armor sets that can only be bought in a store. It is horrendous. Cosmetic progression and individualization is one of the core appeals of an RPG endgame. Making it a reward for cash destroys a core pillar of the design, a design that has been central to the genre's appeal for more than 2 decades. Here is the solution. A true transmog system that lets you make any armor look like any other. Those Eververse sets drop in the game, but must be paid for to equip. So those amazing Vex-themed Eververse sets from Shadowkeep drop in the game as a rare reward for that seasonal event that I don't even remember what it's called. Like everything else, the drop rates in these armor pieces need to come way down, but they all drop in the game. Getting them would put them in your collection tab, showing that you've gotten it. But to actually equip them as an ornament, you need to buy a transmog currency from Eververse. Let's call that currency Armor Blueprints. This works for any armor set in the game. If you want to make your set look like the Escalation Protocol set, you need to have first gotten all the pieces to drop. Then, you go to the store and you buy the blueprints that allows you to convert the set to an ornament. $2 per piece or $8 for the entire set. This will increase revenue and not decrease it, and flood the game with all of the cosmetic armor sets that will suddenly be converted to gameplay rewards. It will also add hundreds of hours of play as players go back to every activity, unlocking complete sets so that they can mix and match as ornaments. Suddenly, the entire 3-year armor loot pool is useful and desirable again. This same system would hold true for emotes. Bungie can hold back some things that don't fit the game's aesthetics as straight Eververse purchases. Things like Halloween-themed sets, or cross-promotional items like Star Wars-themed sets if you can get Disney on board, or helmets that look like Hal from 2001: Space Odyssey. Things like the Scooty Puff Jr. Sparrow, or weird ghost shells can still be sold for cash, but almost everything else in the store would move to this model. This includes making all of the best weapon skins, armor glows, etc. drops. It would massively expand the loot pool in-game and instantly make almost every single activity relevant again. All the skins for Outbreak would drop in the dungeon and various Fallen-themed activities like strikes and adventures. Everything becomes drops in the game that can only be converted to ornaments or unlocked for equipping in the shop. To be more fair, there would still be free ways to unlock some of these things very slowly. Bright Dust would be available in quantities just enough to get maybe one set worth of armor blueprints per season. Suddenly, players have a full transmog system, making every single piece of armor in the game desirable. And the very best looking sets that Bungie is now keeping locked in Eververse could instead be put into the end game, giving players the crucially important incentive to run those activities. Tons of the best weapon skins and emotes can be scattered in the older raids, making them worth running weekly again. And tons more put into planetary patrol, lost sectors, and public event rewards to make those worth running. It instantly creates hundreds of hours of long-term goals, and utterly eliminates the tension between the RPG pillar and Bungie's need to make money. Cosmetic progression is a crucial part of an RPG's content, and right now, Destiny 2 is utterly lacking in it. It is literally worse than it has ever been at any time in the game's history. Huge parts of the game's content are utterly divorced from gameplay, eliminating a core pillar of its long-term appeal. Until this changes, my desire to play will remain very low. FOMO can blow me. On to the Season Pass model. It too, like the cosmetic content, is awful and needs to be changed. The idea of having huge parts of the game appear and disappear is so comically uneconomical from a market economics point of view, I'm kind of shocked that nobody realized the tremendous flaw in it. When you make content disappear over the course of 12 weeks, you also make it impossible for me to pay you for the very expensive content you've made unless I buy it immediately. It feels like extortion, Bungie, and I don't negotiate with terrorists. When Black Armory launched, I was already deep into one of my periods of Destiny fatigue that results from repeated, depressing exposure to all the previous flaws I pointed out, so I didn't buy the Season Pass. I took a few months off and played other things. Then when Destiny was given away for free on PC, I jumped back in. This was near the end of Season of the Drifter, and you know what happened? The same thing that usually happens. I remembered, oh yeah, Destiny's a really great shooter. And so I bought the Season Pass and I played Black Armory, Drifter, and Opulence, which kept me engaged right through the Big Fall expansion. I'm in a similar period of fatigue now, and Bungie has made it literally impossible for me to do that again. I can't buy the last season, or this season, because they will disappear. I can't earn that cool Battle Pass armor because it is literally gone. I can't play the Sundial because it is now lost in the Aether. Bungie, the odds are 100% that in a month or so, I will be back in the game, and instead of being able to pay you and play all the stuff I missed, I will be unable to pay you and cannot play the stuff I missed. How is this a better financial model than the one that came before? By going to a FOMO model, you made it so that people like me just miss out and can't buy the content your studio spent thousands and thousands of hours meticulously crafting. All of those artists who agonized about where to place a fucking rock in the sundial and how to light it just so, well, fuck them. It's all gone, and I'll never marvel over their efforts. It melted away into nothing. By trying to make a model that coerced me into never stopping playing, you made me stop playing and took away any incentive to come back until there is something permanent to come back to. This has to go. Revitalizing older content like raids and strikes that stay around permanently seems like a far more satisfying model than making throwaway modes that disappear. Just from the point of view of an artist, how much love and effort can really go into a project that designers know are only meant to be extant for 12 weeks? Is that really pushing your team to give the best they have? I'm skeptical. Story and a changing world. Lastly, let's talk about the final piece of the puzzle: story and gameplay changes in an ongoing game. Let's start with the story. It is just abysmal outside of the big fall releases, and even there it only rises to competent. And as always, this isn't the lore, which is great, but the story, which is comically awful, not because you employ people who lack talent, but because they are clearly flying by the seat of their pants as a result of failure to plan the story in advance. P.S. Please, make the lore the story. It's not as hard as it might immediately seem. Those stories in the lore that seem cool, they are. Make those the story. There you go, you're welcome. Let me give an example of a typical failure in Destiny's storycraft. Wrath of the Machine was saved by a great map and raid, but the story was extremely poor. So poor, it's almost impossible to even remember. I honestly don't know who Axis was. I don't think I ever knew. I killed him like 35 times, but I don't know who, what, when, where, or why of Axis. How is this even conceivably possible, Bungie? There was a lot of talk when you announced this new model of moving the story forward, and I believe that deep down that is your honest ambition. It's a great ambition to have. However, the execution of that ambition has been an abject failure in every way possible. The story of Shadowkeep was so non-existent, it's shocking. I know that Bungie employs incredibly talented people, which means the process here is broken somehow. When you buy a new Warcraft expansion, you are in for over a year of consistent narrative expansion. Characters do things, events happen, evolve, and are resolved, leading to the next thing. Often those next things are direct results of what came before. What is the connection between Forsaken, Drifter, Opulence, and Shadowkeep as far as story goes? In the game, not in the lore, in the game. What even happened in Shadowkeep? Like, literally bare bones storyboard outline of what happened. Explain it to me. You can't, because ultimately, nothing actually happened to no one beyond a series of barely related events that had no impact on any character or aspect of the world. Why was Eris on the moon? How did she release the nightmares? What are the nightmares outside of gameplay sections? How was the Vex arrival connected to the events of Shadowkeep? And is that connection a compelling forwarding of an ongoing plot? Or convenience that is ex post facto figured out to justify the next activity? Who is leading the Cabal at the Sundial? What is the political situation of the Cabal as we speak? Answer this. How has any character changed as a result of the previous 4 content releases? How has the universe of Destiny changed? In Warcraft, expansions see huge shifts in the balance of power between factions. Leaders rise and fall and die, and new ones take their place. The world itself is changed over time, and what came before leads to what comes next. It's not always good, and it's often pretty cliche because it is highly constrained by its fantasy genre, but at the very least, things happen. Strikes, lost sectors, campaign missions, raids, and seasonal events. They all need to be worked into the narrative, not have the narrative worked around them. And not in the, hey, I need 4 Vex eyes, go to this place. They need to be considered campaign events that push a cohesive story forward, which means that the cohesive story must exist in advance. Destiny has just utterly failed at this. Story is simply not a reward for your purchase, like nutrition is not a reward for your Dairy Queen purchase. You'll get something, but it won't be very good, and it will ultimately lead to nothing but a cold feeling of emptiness. It's the same issue that Destiny had in year 1. What was the outcome of the Red War? It's been years since that, and we still have no idea what the Traveler waking up means. It is completely impossible to tell a story at this pace, Bungie. There is no momentum, and it feels like a series of unconnected events that exist as discrete and ultimately extremely disappointing moments in time. The seasonal model had the potential, for all its other terrible flaws, to at least begin the process of telling an ongoing story, but it simply has not. And that removes story from being a reason to stay around. Yes, it's cool that Saint 14 popped up, but what does it mean? What's going on with the Fallen? How is the city being governed? What are the competing factions, alliances, betrayals? The lore of the last 3 years is overflowing with dozens and dozens and dozens of excellent, complex, compelling narrative threads that could easily serve as the foundation for the game's ongoing narrative. The Fallen themselves are ripe for a wonderful story about their reawakening in the light of the Traveler, while the forces of greed and the brutality of their culture leads to a civil war we need to help resolve. But rather than using the dozens of untouched, high-quality narratives you've paid people to write, you instead repeatedly return to, here's another bad guy who showed up to do bad guy things and we don't really know why, but you should definitely go shoot them now. Bungie, you need to take a long and hard look and make an actual plan. Create a real universe and then make things happen in it. Look at your characters and ask yourselves what they want, then put them in places that challenge that. The story in Destiny is just so awful. It's another core pillar of an ongoing RPG that simply doesn't exist with Destiny. Lastly, I want to address one thing that doesn't have an easy and obvious solution. This is the only one that requires actual resources to address and can bump up against financial issues that I fully understand. The ongoing world of a game like this needs not only changes in its world and story, those changes need to impact gameplay in a meaningful way. Classes need to significantly change and be added. The Fallen need to become allies and be playable, or the Cabal need to be allies and become playable. New enemies must come about more than once every 3 years. The open worlds of Destiny need wildlife and changes to the environment over time. If you want to have a changing world and you can't keep growing the game, then make an expansion be a war on Nessus where new enemies arrive and totally changes the map. Fallen become a playable ally with their own subclass. Nothing in the entire universe of Destiny ever changes in a meaningful way, right down to the map. The Siva expansion was lighter on content than the Taken King, but it's ultimately fondly recalled because it felt good to have a part of Destiny's universe changed in a tangible way. Destiny doesn't feel like it ever changes because it's just so very slow to change. No new enemies, no new skills or abilities or classes, no new playable races, no real build progression that lasts more than a few weeks. The artifact system could be a really compelling progression system, but it can't be 12 weeks long. It's not even worth the effort then. Destiny does not need the variety that the amount of frames and Warframe brings. And it doesn't need the crazy amount of classes that Warcraft has built up over 15 years, whatever it's been, 14 I guess. But it needs to have things change more often than it has, which is never. Story must move forward and change the characters, the politics, the alliances, and the people in the universe. Make a long-term plan of where you are going, and then slowly go there with important things that happen beyond, here's a new threat from the old threat, and we wrap it up in 10 weeks. Until things like this change, Destiny will always be a game that brings me in for big content drops and then slowly exhausts me with its contradictions and shallowness until I give up a year later. Please, commit to real progression. Please, make money from the Eververse without eliminating core pillars of an online game. Please move the world forward and give me new things to shoot more than once every 3 years. Even just dogs, Bungie. Just put fucking dogs on Earth next month. Then flying lizards on Mars 4 months later. Maybe some fucking gorillas on Nessus. How is the universe of Destiny inhabited only by bipedal sentient spacefaring races? Why don't we know who runs the last city? Does Zavala make local zoning decisions? Bungie, do the people of the last city vote? Why don't we have some interactions with the various enemies beyond shooting them? The game doesn't need to be Mass Effect, but its universe needs to feel real, and that means paying careful attention to in-game world building in a way that makes me understand the world and my place within it. Things need to change, Bungie. Start with the easy stuff, and you can contact me by email for where to mail the check. Alright, that's why I've stopped playing Destiny this time. I guess I'll be back in November for as long as the new content keeps it interesting. Thanks for coming, and share this on Reddit if you think it's worth talking about. Alright, bye.